Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray, your weekly fix of 10 minutes or thereabouts of ancient warfare related ranting and raving as I attempt to answer a question from a viewer, listener or reader. That's what I do. I answer questions, you send them in, you can send them in to me by postcard, via email, you can comment on a previous podcast, video or stream. You can, of course, back us on Patreon, one of three different levels, Legionary, Optio, and Centurion. Now, today's question is from John. Now, John, so no offense, John. John's fine, but username Serbogo2002. I much prefer Serbogo. But anyway, John has asked this question. I watched the trailer for the 2026 movie The Odyssey, starring Matt Damon as Odysseus, which will be on general release in July 2026. Mark your diaries now. As you know, the Trojan War is believed to have taken place in the 12th or 13th century BC. The helmets and armour of the Greeks, Achaeans, were as depicted on the front cover illustration of AWA403, issue 3, where warriors of the time period were wearing horned helmets or boar-tusk helmets. I have the book The Ancient Greece of Odysseus by Peter Connolly, which also depicts the Achaean heroes wearing similar helmets. But strangely, all of the movies on the Trojan War and its aftermath show the Greek Achaean warriors wearing helmets and armour from a much later period, in fact many hundreds of years after the Trojan War. Furthermore, the vast majority of illustrations and books on the Iliad and the Odyssey also reflect this obsession with a much later period of Greek history as far as the military costumes are concerned. The helmets shown are generally Corinthian helmets. In the Odyssey trailer, a Corinthian helmet is shown in one scene, but Matt Damon and his warriors appear to be wearing the open-faced Chalcidian helmet. The Corinthian helmet was developed around 600 BC, while the Chalcidian helmet is believed to have developed or been popular in the 5th and 4th centuries BC. How did this anomalous situation with military costumes of significantly different time periods in Greek history happen? Wow. Okay. It's complicated. It's that movie. Yet again, I think the last 6 or 7 I've referenced it. Anyway, there's a whole series of things that go on. One is our modern perception of what a Greek warrior looks like. Air commas around Greek warrior for those of you just listening. Is that's what we expect a Greek warrior to look like, that it is a Corinthian helmet. One of the things that's happened since the Miller 300 came out is that aberration, I don't want to be that harsh, that aberration of a Corinthian helmet has become, oh, this is what Greek helmets were. No Greek helmet ever looked like the helmets in 300. That's a different issue. But that idea of shifting what our accepted perception of what a Greek warrior looks like is very tricky. And so you've got the Greek warrior who basically is a hoplite. He's wearing he's wearing linen or linothorax armor. He's wearing an aspis, a Corinthian helmet with a crest. He has a dory, which is a thrusting spear. Important. We'll get to that. And so that is the importance of the warrior in a Greek context. Now, that Greek warrior in visual, like I'm talking 20th and 21st centuries here, is from the earliest period of Greek history all the way through to Alexander the Great and even after. And so a Greek is a Greek is a Greek. Now, we see a similar thing with Roman legionaries, that Roman legionaries are wearing banded armor, lorica segmentata. They have a curved rectangular shield. They have a particular kind of helmet, normally what used to be called the Italic G and now is the Vicinal helmet. That's only a very small period of time, 200 years maybe, of what the Roman legionary looked like. But when you look at visual representations of the Roman legionaries from Romulus and Remus all the way through to the 6th century, when you get the last Roman, which is Theodosius, it's Justinian, Procopius, things like that. So that's more than 1,000 years of Roman military history depicted by one look of what a Roman legionary looked like, which really only lasted from the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. Anyway, so I think that's your first answer, is that this is what Greek warriors look like to us, the 20th and 21st century viewer. To change that requires some monumental shift, and bizarrely, the Miller 300 achieved that. Not that it was trying to, but it did because of the popularity. It's not history; it's a cartoon. It's a graphic novel turned into a live action remake. Lots of problems with that. I think we did a big podcast on the issues with it. The second issue is not modern people's fault. The second issue is ancient people's fault. Fault is perhaps a weighted term. And that is that the majority of depictions of Homeric warfare in Greek art are from the period of classical Greek pottery and sculpture. And so they have depicted Achilles and Ajax and all of the other characters from the Trojan War in contemporary armour, which indeed, when those things start to appear in Greek art in the 6th and 5th centuries BC, are indeed hoplite, Corinthian helmets, aspis shields, dories. So that's one of the next reasons, is that when those myths become popular in Greek art, they're depicted in that way, which has led on to how we perceive Greek warriors and how they're perceived. But it was how the Greeks in the 6th and 5th centuries BC perceived them too. When you go back to an earlier period in Greek art, and in the late geometric period, they're only just beginning to put in human figures. They're kind of stick figurey. Talked about that before. When they start to come in with a little bit more identifiable individuality, we get the story of Ajax carrying Achilles' body over his shoulders, and that's very obvious. We get the Actorione, the conjoined twins. That's very obvious because you get one waist, 4 legs, 4 arms, 2 heads. So those myths are very obvious, but they're not in the way that we would expect Greek art to show these warriors from the Trojan War, even though most Greek art, no matter what time period, is interpreted as being from the Homeric poems. Probably many of the actual stories are lost, and those are a source, but there are other sources too. And there's some really fabulous articles about, for instance, the blinding of the Cyclops by Odysseus, that when you look at the artistic depictions on Greek art and across various cultures, they don't actually get their blinding right based on what's written in the Homeric poems, that actually it's not in the right direction, it's more than one person, all of that sort of things. So that's the next thing, is that Greek art depicts these warriors in this way. The third one, which is slightly more complex, is the fact that when Homer is writing, and we think mid-8th century BC, this is when some of this material is starting to come in, that the aspis shield, the Argive shield as it used to be called, is coming in that period, and you start to see it in Greek art. And so that's the period of warfare when Homer wrote, and that's the period of warfare Homer is describing, which of course is complicated. And again, we've talked about that in the big podcast. That is Homeric warfare, the warfare of the Trojan War, or is it the warfare that he's describing? And that too is tricky, because he describes things like the boar's tusk helmet in very intricate detail. Now, peculiarly, the boar's tusk helmet is actually earlier than the Trojan War, around the 15th century BC. So by the time of the Trojan War, it's actually an out-of-date helmet. That's not to say it wasn't worn, wearing granddad's medals, similar. And a helmet's a helmet. And if you see those boar's tusk helmets there in museums today, they're still operable. What's 100 years or 200 years as opposed to 2,000 years? Now, the next issue is that the Chalcidian helmet, and this comes back to the helmets of the 300 too. The reason for an open-faced helmet is you've got Matt Damon and several other very prominent actors. If you put them in a proper Corinthian helmet, it might as well be anybody. It's kind of Mandalorian-esque. Shock horror, Pedro Pascal is not acting the Mandalorian anymore. Well, why would he need to? It's a helmet, it's a face-covering helmet. It's just a body, and it's voiced by Pedro Pascal. So similarly, you could save a lot of money in your Odysseus movie if you just said, right, you're all wearing full face-covering helmets, no one's ever taking them off, and we'll just get you to voice the character and someone else can act it, and they'll be buff and they'll make you look great. Yeah, so that's, I think, the next issue, is that open-faced helmets are about recognizing the stars being used for your movie. So I think there are some sops as well. So the Trojan War, of course, probably happened. If it happened in the way that we're told, unlikely. Some things that did happen have been expanded upon and turned into myth. But there is a mythological sort of skin around the Trojan War. And I think that also allows permission for filmmakers and other artists to turn the Trojan War into something that it probably wasn't. I know that the movie Troy from 2004 gets a lot of grief. There's many things in that movie that I actually quite like about how it shows armour, combat, and things that are perhaps not correct, but we don't know what correct was. But they're really interesting sort of explorations of what it might have looked like and what it might have been. The martial art of Trojan War warfare, for instance, I have no problem with how they did that. Whereas, the interesting thing about the way that the classical Greek hoplite is depicted is, of course, we presume that is the classical Greek hoplite of phalanx warfare, which is not the heroic warfare of the Trojan War. And the problem with the Trojan War in that sense is that most of the combat is described as duels. There's, very little massed combat, and yet at the same time, the phalanxes, and Homer does use the term phalanx, but we don't think it's a technical term. We think it's just used as a mass of men. One of the problems with technical terms in Greek history is that sometimes they're used technically and sometimes they're not, by the same author in sentences not that far apart. But the other thing is that the evolution of hoplite warfare, which is still an academic debate, is one where you've got dueling. The current issue of the magazine is looking at the Battle of the 300 Champions in 546 BC, which is 300 on each side of Argives versus Spartans. Was it 300 duels? Was it 150 duels where the men fought in pairs? Was it small phalanxes? We don't know. And so the interesting thing there is that when you look at the earliest versions of Greek art from around that same time, in the mid-6th century BC, they look like hoplites, but the current argument is that they didn't fight like hoplites, as in they didn't fight in a phalanx as we understand it. And indeed, you can see on some of their spears that each man has two throwing spears. You can tell by whether they have the throwing thong. I forget the exact Greek term at the moment in my head. And also the spearhead is different from the later Dori thrusting spear. In those early Greek art, you can tell the difference between the spearheads not by dories, but by hunting spears on cavalry versus the throwing javelins of the infantry. So they have more than one. So they're throwing things rather than thrusting things. And then they draw their sword after they've thrown both their javelins, which again, Troy in 2004 did show. So I think there's that as well, that they look like a hoplite, but they're not a hoplite. Whereas we see hoplites and we think hoplite warfare. And you've also got Boeotian shields versus Aspides shields. You've got various different ideas going on in Greek art, but we tend to look at Greek art in that same way that we look at this is what a Greek warrior looked like. And so that's a problem as well, that the nuances of Greek art in terms of showing exactly contemporary warfare are lost to us because we see a later form of warfare that looks very similar to that earlier Greek form of warfare, and we go, well, it's all the same, which is problematic. So I think the issue with the movie and the issue with the trailer and the depiction of the trailer is a combination of all those things. So you've got modern perceptions of what Greek warriors look like. You've got ancient perceptions of what Greek warriors look like. You've got Homer writing in a period when this look was becoming common. You've got the idea of a sort of a mythological skin over Homer, so that allows all of these kinds of ideas. And then you've got, I've got to recognize my big star. I'm paying money for Matt Damon. I need to see Matt Damon. So I hope that answers your question, John. And you can join me again for another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers. Thanks. Bye.